It had been years since I'd gone camping, but I thought this trip might be the perfect chance to reconnect with my brother. We'd always shared a love for the outdoors, our childhood weekends spent hiking, fishing, and roughing it in the wilds. But life, as it often does, came between us. A fight, something petty and stupid, a misunderstanding that festered into resentment. One thing led to another, and we hadn't spoken in over 5 years. When he reached out, asking if I wanted to meet up for a camping trip, I couldn't say no. Maybe it was time to bury the hatchet. We met at the trailhead, where he greeted me with a tight, awkward hug. "It's been too long," he said, his voice edged with uncertainty. "I've missed this," I replied, unsure of what else to say. We weren't the same brothers we'd been as kids, but I hoped we could find our way back. The first night, we set up camp by a clearing surrounded by tall pines. We pitched our tents, got a fire going, and sat down to eat. It felt normal, familiar, like nothing had ever happened between us. We talked about the old days, the pranks we'd pulled, the stupid stuff we'd done. Laughter came easily, and for a few hours it was as though the years apart had never happened. But as the evening wore on, something shifted. The laughter faded, replaced by a quiet that stretched on too long. My brother stared into the flames, his eyes distant, unfocused. The crackling fire was the only sound that broke the silence. Then, almost in a whisper, he spoke. "I'm sorry for what I did." The words hit me like a cold gust of wind. I couldn't tell if he was apologizing for the fight or something else. Something that, for a moment, felt far more significant. "Don't worry about it," I said, trying to brush it off. "It was a long time ago. We're here now, right?" But he didn't respond. He just kept staring into the fire, his face unreadable. The air around us thickened, as though the temperature had dropped a few degrees in an instant. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, but the chill only deepened. Then I heard it. A whisper, low and faint, drifting through the trees. At first I thought it was the wind, but the voices seemed to carry words, fragments of sentences, whispers of regret. They weren't from my brother, they were coming from somewhere else, something else. I turned to look at him, but his face had gone pale. His eyes were wide, locked onto something I couldn't see. "What the hell is that?" I asked, my voice tight. But my brother didn't answer. Instead, he slowly stood up and began to walk toward the trees, his movements slow, deliberate. I followed him, confused and a little concerned. "Jake, what are you doing?" He didn't look back. He just walked deeper into the woods, the whispers growing louder. I couldn't make out the words, but they sounded like regrets. Like apologies for things that could never be undone. I rushed after him, calling his name, but my voice felt swallowed by the thick, damp air. It was like the forest was pulling him in, urging him forward. When I finally caught up, he was standing at the edge of a clearing, looking down at something on the ground. It took me a moment to recognize it, a set of footprints in the dirt, small, faded, like they had been there for years. "Jake?" I said, my voice trembling. He didn't respond. Instead, he looked up at the trees, his eyes wide with something I couldn't place, fear, confusion, or maybe something worse. Then, almost too softly to hear, he whispered, "I'm sorry." I reached out to grab his arm, but before I could, he turned sharply and sprinted off into the woods. "Jake, stop!" I shouted, panic rising in my chest. But he didn't stop. He was fast, faster than I'd ever seen him run, disappearing into the darkness. I ran after him, my heart pounding in my ears. The forest seemed to shift around me, the trees twisting into shapes I couldn't understand. The air was thick, heavy, as if something was pressing down on my chest. The whispers came again, louder now, closer. I lost track of time as I ran, the world around me becoming a blur of dark trees and moonlight. My breath came in ragged gasps as I tried to catch up with him, but no matter how fast I ran, I couldn't reach him. The woods seemed endless. Finally, I stumbled into a clearing, and that's when I saw it. His tent. It was set up, just as we had left it. But there was no sign of my brother. No gear, no belongings, nothing. It was as though he had vanished, leaving behind only the faintest trace of his presence. I searched the area, calling his name, but there was nothing. No sign of him anywhere. Just the wind and the whispers, growing louder, more urgent. I couldn't make sense of it. How could he just disappear like that? The next morning, I searched for hours. I called out for him, but the forest answered only with silence. I retraced every step, hoping for a clue, but all I found were those strange, faded footprints. And yet I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, somewhere, watching me. Waiting for me to understand what he had done. When I left that day, I took nothing but the memory of his last words. "I'm sorry." To this day, I hear his voice in the wind. When the air is still, when the trees are quiet, his apology is all that lingers. And sometimes, just before I fall asleep, I hear him whispering to me, "I'm sorry." And I know, deep down, that it's not the wind at all. It's him. I needed to escape. The demands of my job had left me drained, my mind cluttered with endless tasks, deadlines, and a sense of unrelenting pressure. Life, too, had felt like it was piling on, too many things left unsaid, unresolved, and forgotten. So I packed my gear, threw a tent into the back of my car, and drove until the city faded away, leaving only the vast expanse of trees and silence. I needed to disconnect, to find peace again. The first few nights were exactly what I needed. The air was crisp and clean, the only sound the rustling of the leaves and the occasional bird call. I spent my days hiking, exploring the woods, and my nights staring up at the stars, grateful for the solitude. It felt like I was finally starting to breathe again. But by the fourth night, everything changed. I woke up in the middle of the night with the distinct sensation that I wasn't alone. It wasn't the usual feeling of someone standing in the doorway, or the soft whisper of someone calling my name from the shadows. No, this was different. It was the unmistakable presence of someone sitting beside me, the weight of their body pressing down on the ground next to my sleeping bag. I froze. The kind of fear that grips you from the inside out, leaving your body stiff and your heart pounding in your throat, swept over me. Was I dreaming? Had I fallen asleep while hiking, and this was some twisted nightmare my mind had conjured? No. I could feel the weight shift in the air. The space around me felt heavier, more tangible, as though the very atmosphere was charged with a presence that didn't belong. Slowly I held my breath, listening. There was a faint sound, slow, deliberate breathing. The kind of breath you hear when someone is close, when the air feels almost too warm and too cold at the same time. My heart thudded against my ribs as I tried to process it, my mind scrambling for some logical explanation. But there was nothing. I slowly, almost painfully, turned my head to the side, my neck stiff from the tension that gripped me. My eyes darted through the darkness of the tent, but I saw nothing. Nothing except the shifting shadows of my own breath in the cold, and the overwhelming chill that seemed to wrap around me. Nothing but the air, thick with something, someone. I couldn't explain it, but I knew something was there. The breathing continued, slow and measured. I could feel it almost as if it were in my own chest. I tried to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks, that it was the wind outside rustling the trees, but the sound of it was too deliberate, too precise. My instincts screamed that it was real. I lay still, my body frozen, my heart racing, unsure of what to do. The idea of moving, of looking around, seemed impossible. What if I saw something I couldn't explain? What if it was worse than I imagined? I closed my eyes, willing myself to fall back to sleep, to wake up and realize it had all been a dream. But the sound of breathing was still there, relentless. Time seemed to stretch out forever. I don't know how long I lay there, staring at the inside of my tent, heart hammering in my chest, but eventually, the breathing stopped. The air seemed to lighten, the weight lifting just enough for me to feel like I could breathe again. But I couldn't sleep. The fear had seeped into my bones, and there was no way I was going to close my eyes and risk whatever it was returning. I stayed awake, listening to the silence, feeling the coldness cling to my skin like a second layer. Every sound outside the tent became a potential threat: twigs breaking, leaves rustling, the wind howling in the distance. I could hear everything, but the most unsettling part was the absence of anything that could explain what had just happened. By morning, I was exhausted. I gathered my things mechanically, still shaken from the night before, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. Something about the quiet, the isolation, still called to me. Maybe it was the sense of unfinished business, or maybe it was the fear that leaving would mean confronting whatever had been in my tent. I left, but as I packed up and began to drive away, my mind kept returning to that feeling, the weight of another presence in the tent, the deliberate breathing, the coldness that had settled into my skin. I didn't want to believe it was real, but the truth was, I had no explanation for it. The worst part came when I returned to the camp the next day to pack up the last of my things. That's when I saw them, the footprints. They were in the dirt around my tent, clear as day. I could make out the shape of boots, though not mine. I knew I had been alone. I had never seen anyone near the site, not even a hiker. No one had passed through in days, not since I set up camp. The footprints were too fresh to have been left by anyone else before me. They circled my tent once, then led off into the woods. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at those footprints, my stomach twisted in a knot. Who had been there? Who had walked around my tent? My mind raced, running through every possibility, but I couldn't come up with a single rational explanation. I had stayed alone in many places before, and I had never once felt this violation. The feeling that I wasn't just in the woods, but being watched, hunted. And the strangest thing of all was the fact that the footprints led into the woods, deeper into the trees, where they just disappeared. I left the campsite in a hurry, driving away without looking back. The rest of the drive felt like a blur, my thoughts consumed by the image of those footprints, and the feeling of something, or someone, sitting next to me in the tent. I never went back to that campsite. And to this day, I'm not sure what happened. Was it a prank? A strange encounter with another camper who hadn't been brave enough to reveal themselves? Or was it something else, something that had always been there, lurking just beyond my awareness? I don't know. But the woods have a way of holding on to their secrets, and I have a feeling that whatever it was that sat beside me in that tent, it hasn't finished with me yet. I was never supposed to end up here. Not in the woods, not in this remote, forgotten place. I never dreamed I'd be the one camping alone in the wilderness, away from everything and everyone. But after years of pushing through life's struggles, after everything that happened at home, the unrelenting work I put in to keep myself afloat, I needed space. A chance to breathe. It was as if the world I had carefully built around myself was slowly crumbling, and I didn't know how to fix it. I wasn't rich, not by any means. I didn't own fancy cars or designer suits. But I had a modest business that kept me afloat, a small construction company I'd started from the ground up. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine, something I'd built with blood, sweat, and endless hours of work. It wasn't the life I had imagined, but it was the one I had made. What people didn't know about me, what I never talked about, was the past that haunted me. My childhood wasn't something you could forget. I lived with a man who wasn't my real father, but he might as well have been. My mother, God bless her, tried to protect me, but she was too lost in her own confusion to see the truth. She had married him when I was young, searching for stability after the mess of her previous relationships. But my stepfather was far from stable. He was violent, unpredictable, and manipulative, and as a kid, I had no way of understanding why he hated me. I was never an easy kid. I was defiant, rebellious, and always questioning the world around me. I suppose that made me an easy target for a man who already had a temper, someone looking for an outlet for his own frustrations. The first time he hit me, I was about 12. It wasn't a full-blown beating, just a slap across the face, but it was enough to send a message. My mother, when she found out, told me to just be quiet, to let it go. She was too afraid of him, too caught up in her own survival to care about mine. As the years went on, the beatings got worse. He would hit me for the smallest things, forgetting to take out the trash, not finishing my homework, or simply being too loud. Every night I'd lie in bed, hoping he wouldn't come into my room. I'd hear him coming down the hall, and my stomach would twist into knots. I wasn't even sure if I was more afraid of the physical pain or the emotional toll it took to pretend like everything was fine. The fear I lived with, it was always there. I could never escape it. My mother, in her own way, enabled him. She always told me I was too much to handle, that I needed to respect him. And while part of me understood she was scared too, it didn't stop the hurt. I didn't understand why she couldn't just leave him. She loved me, but she couldn't protect me. Eventually, I left home. I worked at jobs here and there, barely scraping by. But when I turned 25, I finally saved enough to start my own business. It wasn't anything big, just a few contracts here and there, doing construction and repair work. I didn't have much, but I had my independence. And for the first time, I felt free, like I could finally breathe without the weight of my past dragging me down. But as time went on, the past came back. No matter how hard I tried to push it away, it followed me. The voices, the nightmares. I didn't believe in ghosts or anything supernatural, but there were nights when the memories felt so real, I thought I might go mad. I kept working, too busy, too focused on the grind to let myself think. But the fear, the anxiety, it was always there, lurking under the surface. I wasn't looking for a spiritual awakening when I read about the northern woods. It was just a random article, something about an isolated part of the country that promised peace and quiet, away from the noise of the world. The forest was said to be full of old, abandoned places that hadn't been touched by human hands in decades. It sounded perfect for someone like me, someone who just wanted to forget for a while. I packed my things, bare essentials, nothing fancy, and made the long drive out to the woods. The landscape was beautiful in an eerie way. The trees stretched high, their branches tangled together like hands reaching out to grab you. The air smelled like wet earth, a bit musty but fresh at the same time. It was the kind of place where silence wasn't just a lack of noise, it was a presence, thick and heavy, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. The first night I set up camp. A small fire crackled in front of me, the flames flickering with a life of their own. I sat there, staring into the fire, wondering why I was here. What was I really trying to escape from? The constant grind of work? The years of bitterness I'd accumulated? Or was it something deeper, a part of myself I couldn't face? As the night deepened, the temperature dropped. The darkness seemed to creep closer, like the woods were closing in on me. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up, but I told myself it was just the chill in the air. But then I heard something. At first I thought it was the wind, a faint rustling, a whispering sound, like someone calling my name. I froze, trying to figure out if I was imagining it. But then it came again, clearer this time. "Come closer, son." The voice was deep, rough. Familiar. I felt a shiver run down my spine. My stepfather? No, that was impossible. He was dead. He had died in a drunk driving accident years ago, long before I'd ever started my business. But there was something about that voice, something that pulled at me, that made my stomach churn. "Dad?" I whispered, unable to help myself. I wanted to laugh at how ridiculous I sounded, but my throat tightened. I couldn't move. The voice had come from the woods, from the darkness beyond the firelight. It was then that the memories hit me, one after the other, the way he looked at me with those cold eyes, the feeling of his hand around my throat, the sound of his voice as he screamed at me. And with those memories came the dream. The dream that had haunted me for years. It was always the same. I would wake up, drenched in sweat, my heart racing. I was a kid again, no older than 12, standing at the foot of my bed. My mother and stepfather would be standing there, just staring at me. They didn't speak. They didn't move. Their eyes were empty, hollow. and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't scream. The terror would freeze me in place, my body unable to move, my mouth unable to make a sound. "Come to me," the voice said again, but this time it was closer, right behind me. I spun around, my breath caught in my throat. The woods were dark, the trees too thick to see beyond. But there was nothing there. No figure, no shape, just the unsettling feeling that I wasn't alone. I turned back to the fire, my hands shaking. The flame flickered, casting eerie shadows on the ground. I sat there for what felt like hours, my thoughts tangled in the fog of fear and confusion. Had I imagined the voice? Was it the wind, the stress of everything catching up with me? It had been a few months since Sarah passed. It felt like a lifetime, but also like it had just happened yesterday. The pain of losing her had carved a wound so deep that, sometimes, it was all I could think about. But then there was Adam. My son. My reason to get out of bed each morning. The one light I still had in the world. I never had the chance to bond with him in the way I'd always dreamed. Sarah and I had planned camping trips, long weekends in the woods, just the three of us. But life got in the way, and then, she was gone. After her funeral, I found myself staring at the empty house, at the life we used to share. The silence was deafening. Adam and I were like two strangers living in the same place. He didn't know how to grieve, and neither did I. One evening, after weeks of sitting in the stillness of our home, I decided to do something, anything, to try and bring us closer again. A camping trip. Just the two of us. I'd always thought it would be a way for us to reconnect. I thought it would be a good idea, maybe even a healing experience. So, I packed up our things and drove us to the mountains. The same mountains where I had spent some of my happiest days as a child. The first night, we sat by the fire, roasting marshmallows and talking about trivial things. It felt almost normal. Adam wasn't his usual self, but at least he was talking. That was progress, right? We heard the rustling of the trees as the wind whispered through them, but something about the way the branches moved felt off. "Daddy, do you see him?" Adam asked, pointing into the dark line of trees that bordered our campsite. I squinted, but saw nothing. "See who, buddy?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "There's a man standing by the trees," Adam said, his voice barely above a whisper, his finger trembling as he pointed. I followed his gaze but saw only shadows. The breeze was picking up, and the sound of the trees swaying made the woods feel alive, almost as if they were watching us. "Probably just the shadows," I said, forcing a reassuring smile. "Nothing to worry about." But the unease didn't leave me. Adam kept looking over his shoulder, eyes wide, as if expecting someone to emerge from the trees. He had always been a sensitive kid, but this felt different. The way he was staring at the shadows unnerved me. Eventually, I convinced him to head into the tent. As I zipped it shut, the night closed in around us, the campfire's warmth fading in the distance. I was exhausted. I lay on my back, staring up at the tent's ceiling, listening to the sounds of the forest around us. It was the kind of night where everything felt too quiet, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. The wind had died down, and the trees were eerily still. But then I heard it. A soft shuffle. I told myself it was just an animal, a deer or maybe a raccoon. I dismissed it, but the sound came again, closer this time. Slow, deliberate. I could almost hear the crunch of gravel beneath the weight of someone's boots. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. "Daddy!" Adam's whisper pierced the darkness, his voice laced with terror. "There's someone outside the tent." I sat up, my pulse quickening. I scanned the space around us, trying to make sense of the situation. I heard the sound again, closer now. It was footsteps. Someone was out there. I grabbed the flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent door, my breath shallow. "Stay here, Adam," I said, though I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't want to seem scared, but the terror in my chest was real. The cold night air hit my face as I stepped outside, the flashlight's beam cutting through the darkness. The woods around me seemed to press in, alive with the hum of insects and the distant rustle of leaves. But there was no one. No person standing by the trees. Just the emptiness of the forest, staring back at me. I was just about to turn back when I heard it again. "Don't look! Don't look! He's coming for you!" The voice came from the trees, low and drawn out. I froze, my blood running cold. The voice wasn't Adam's. It wasn't even human. I turned back to the tent. Adam was inside, his face pale, eyes wide. He was shaking. "Who's outside?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Nothing," I said, trying to keep my composure. But the fear in his eyes mirrored my own. "Just the wind. It's nothing." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something I couldn't explain. I stayed awake most of the night, listening. The forest was silent again. The footsteps stopped. But those words echoed in my mind. "I'm coming for you." The next morning, the sun rose slowly, as if it didn't want to be there either. I couldn't bring myself to look at the trees again, to face whatever was out there. I tried to go through the motions of a normal morning, breakfast, packing up the camp, but nothing felt right. Adam was unusually quiet. He didn't ask to go fishing or explore the nearby stream like he usually would. Instead, he kept his eyes on the trees, his shoulders hunched, as if waiting for something to happen. That night, I decided we should leave. The trip was supposed to be a bonding experience, but it had turned into something else, something darker. I packed up the tent and our things, ready to head home, but when we reached the truck, something caught my eye. There, in the dirt by the truck, was a single footprint. It was large, the kind of print you might expect from someone wearing boots. But there was something wrong with it. It wasn't just any footprint, it looked unnatural. Distorted, almost as if it had been made by something trying to mimic a human foot but failing. I turned to Adam. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice shaky. "Do you know who left that?" Adam shook his head, his eyes wide with fear. "I told you, Daddy. He's still out there. He's waiting for us." My heart sank. I wanted to tell him it was nothing. That we were just imagining things. But the look in his eyes stopped me. He wasn't lying. As we drove home in silence, the weight of the night's events settled in. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone, or something, following us. But the road behind us remained empty. It wasn't until we reached home, safe in the familiarity of our house, that I realized something strange. The voice. It hadn't been Adam who spoke. It had been someone else. Someone who had been out there, in the woods, watching us. A voice I would never forget. The next morning, I found myself standing in front of the mirror, trying to shake off the unease, but the whisper still lingered in my ears. "Daddy, I'm coming for you." I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't alone. Whatever it was, whatever had been out there in the woods, it had followed us home. And it wasn't finished with me yet. I woke up in the dead of night, drenched in sweat, my heart racing as though it had a mind of its own. I couldn't tell at first whether it was a nightmare or reality. Everything around me felt wrong. I tried to sit up, but my body felt heavy, sluggish, as though it was still tethered to the dream. The air was thick and still, far too still. The campground we'd set up had been lively earlier in the evening, filled with laughter and the crackling of the fire. But now, all I could see was the dim light of my flashlight, casting long, erratic shadows over the untouched grass and our scattered camping gear. My friends, my hiking buddies, were gone. I froze for a moment, a sense of dread creeping up my spine. I called out for them, my voice breaking the oppressive silence, but there was no reply. No rustling of leaves, no response at all. Just the eerie, unnerving quiet that had settled in. It was as if the entire forest had decided to swallow them whole. I rubbed my eyes, hoping to shake off the fog of confusion, but when I looked again, nothing had changed. My friends' tents were still standing, their backpacks were still propped up against the trees where we had left them. No signs of struggle, no indication that they'd left voluntarily. I could feel the knot in my stomach tightening, my pulse quickening. Something wasn't right. I stood up slowly, my feet sinking into the soft earth beneath me. The flashlight in my hand trembled slightly as I swung it over the campsite, casting its feeble light on the surrounding woods. Nothing. The trees stood tall and motionless, their dark silhouettes like silent sentinels watching me. The fire had long since burned out, leaving only cold ash behind. I took a few cautious steps away from the camp, scanning the area. The moon was high in the sky, its pale light filtering through the trees, but it barely touched the forest floor. It was like the woods had swallowed up all the sound, all the life. No birds, no wind rustling through the leaves, just an unnerving, unnatural silence. "Guys?" I called again, but this time, my voice felt almost alien, like a stranger's echo. I could hear the slight crackle of the leaves beneath my boots, but even that seemed muffled, swallowed by the oppressive atmosphere. I spun around, searching the camp for anything out of place. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long, twisting and shifting in a way I couldn't explain. It wasn't the way the light usually worked through the trees, casting shadows that stretched and flickered. No, these were different. These shadows seemed to move of their own accord, writhing just beyond the reach of my flashlight beam. A chill ran down my spine as I took another step toward the edge of the campsite. My breath came in shallow gasps, my heartbeat hammering in my ears. I felt a compulsion to move, to leave, but I couldn't tear myself away from the oddity of it all. Something was wrong here, and I needed to know what. Then I heard it. At first, it was just a soft scraping sound, like something dragging across the forest floor. It was distant, barely audible, but enough to send a jolt of fear through me. I froze, listening harder. The noise grew louder, closer. It was unmistakable now. Something was moving through the woods, its steps slow, deliberate, dragging across the ground as though it was dragging its feet. I tried to call out again, but my throat tightened, and the words caught in my chest. My legs felt unsteady as I turned back to the campsite, but I didn't know why I was returning to the very place that had once felt safe. It didn't feel safe anymore. The dragging sound continued, getting closer. Closer. I could feel the weight of it bearing down on me. My mind raced with possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. What if my friends were out there, in trouble? What if they were hurt? Or worse, what if they were already gone? I wasn't sure how long I stood there, just listening to the sound, trying to gather the courage to move, to act. The air around me felt thick with an unspoken tension, as if the very atmosphere was holding its breath, waiting for something. That's when I saw it. At first I thought it was just a trick of the light, an odd reflection, but as I focused I realized with a creeping sense of horror that it wasn't. Something was standing just beyond the range of my flashlight. A figure, tall and unnaturally still. The shadows clung to it like a shroud, bending and shifting with its every movement. But it didn't move, not right away. It just stood there, watching me. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, each beat a deafening drum. My body refused to obey my commands. I wanted to run, to get away from whatever this was, but my feet were rooted to the spot, and my breath was shallow, like I was underwater. Then the figure moved. It was a slow, deliberate motion, like it had all the time in the world, and it took a step toward me. The dragging sound grew louder, and the air around me seemed to grow colder. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as a low, guttural noise filled the air. It wasn't quite a growl, but something deeper, something more primal. I stumbled back, my flashlight flickering wildly as I tried to back away from the thing in the darkness. My eyes darted around, desperate for a way out, but the forest seemed to close in on me. The shadows stretched longer, darker, like they were coming to life, reaching for me. I couldn't see the figure's face, not clearly. It was obscured by shadows, but I could feel its eyes on me, burning into my soul. My body screamed for me to move, to run, but I couldn't tear my gaze away. The air was thick with tension, every muscle in my body locked in place. The thing took another step. I took one too, stumbling backward, my heart racing. My flashlight flickered again, casting a momentary beam of light across the clearing. In that brief moment, I saw something that froze me in my tracks. The figure wasn't alone. There were others, just beyond the shadows, shifting and moving in the darkness. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I wasn't alone in the forest. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the soft earth, my breath coming in ragged gasps. But no matter how fast I ran, it felt like the shadows were always just behind me, following, dragging their feet in the dirt, getting closer with every step. I don't know how long I ran. It felt like hours, but when I finally collapsed against a tree, gasping for breath, the silence returned. The forest was still, the shadows no longer moving. I waited, listening, my heart thundering in my chest. The dragging sound had stopped. I stayed there, huddled against the tree, waiting for daylight, for the sun to rise and banish the darkness. But when it did, I knew that what I had experienced wasn't just a bad dream. The campsite was still abandoned. My friends' things remained untouched, just as they had been when I woke up. But they were gone. And I had no idea where they had gone, or why the shadows had followed me.